Welcome to episode 39 of the First Person Podcast with me, Giuseppe Femia, the FPS Podcast Producer, Sabrina Sgandurra, our Editor-in-Chief / Book Reviews Editor, Lia Black, our Co-Managing Editor / Commentaries Editor, and Patrick Dolan, our other Co-Managing Editor / Essays Editor. For the month of Halloween, we will be looking at themes that are set up and explored through the game designer's usage of monsters in the horror game genre. Taking into account that mental health has been handled respectfully, we will be giving our experience with how the monsters come off and if the themes were portrayed effectively. But first, who is everybody? And what have you all been playing?
So I am Sabrina. I like to play mostly single-player RPGs. Lately, I've been replaying Hades again, which is not exactly what I'd call a single-player RPG. But in terms of horror, I've also been playing The Forest, and unfortunately, also, I was forced to sit through Visage, which was hell for me.
I'm Patrick, this is my voice, and after I think last podcast I talked about playing Death Stranding, and that blew me away, so I was like, what? I hadn't played a Hideo Kojima game between Metal Gear Solid and Death Stranding, so I went to Metal Gear Solid 5, and a lot more iffiness in Metal Gear Solid 5 than Death Stranding, but I enjoyed it. One thing I think I liked the most was the custom soundtrack, where you could kind of put your own music and listen to it while you're in the game through the Walkman thing, and I of course stuck with I didn't put anything on the soundtrack that was released past 1984, because that's when the game took place. So that was the highlight of the game, I think, and like putting people in balloons and sending them to your mother base, which I'm sure sounds weird, but if you play the game, you know what I'm talking about. And I've also, I guess, just recently finished playing Silent Hill 2 for the first time. I'd started that on stream and finally finished it last night on my own. And it's aged, but it's something else.
And I'm Lia. I, once again, have been playing far too much Overwatch. I've realized that I am a bad DPS, a average tank, and actually like a decent support as I'm climbing my way to Diamond in competitive. So like, not too shabby. I also decided to get Ghost of Tsushima in time for the new patch that's come out now, and I'm bad. I'm trying to get good, but I'm bad.
And as said before, my name is Giuseppe Femia, and I've been playing Bloodborne for the first time. It's pretty much a blind run through because I'm more of a Dark Souls player, 1 and 3. But for Dark Souls, like, I'm familiar enough with it that I know where like most of the stuff is. With Bloodborne, it's all wet and slimy, and there are things that scream at me and guns. So it's a bit different than Dark Souls. Much more Lovecraftian than the medieval, but I'm making my way through it. Yes, I'm having fun with that, is what I tell people.
And they believe you?
I am not being held against my will, no.
Excellent.
So, going off of that, we had a heated discussion in Sabrina's Twitch channel the other day about whether or not Bloodborne was actually considered a horror game. So, leading into that, let's just kind of like look through that as well, but like we'll come back to it. What do you guys think makes for a good horror game in this day and age?
So I hate horror, full disclosure. Not because the genre, like, I hate the genre. I can't handle it. I want to like horror, but I can't because I can't handle it. That being said, my partner is obsessed with horror. So I had a really interesting conversation before I did my stream, because he forced me to do a surprise stream of Visage. And he brought up some really good points about, like, atmosphere being a big one because it sets the tone. Resource and inventory management was huge because having limited access to resources is necessary to sort of facilitate that horror aspect and the horrific elements, but at the same time, like, you don't want to leave them completely stranded, because then the game just doesn't make sense. And the way my partner worded it was, it's like pepper. So when you add just enough pepper to a dish, that it makes it like perfect, but also a little bit spicy. But then if you add too much, then you can't handle it, and if you don't add enough, then it's bland. So, and then there was also like a few other things, like the metaphysical elements, which was a big one. So I think like the whole notion of like disorienting and surreal elements of horror is the most important, at least for me as somebody who can't handle it. That's what always gets me.
Yeah, I think you really hit it with the atmosphere. I kind of feel like what makes horror is so subjective. Like, we did have that debate about Bloodborne. I've never played Bloodborne, but I kind of feel like it has horror themes, so I would call it horror. Like, even if it's not necessarily scary, if it has like Draculas and Frankensteins or whatever, it's horror. But like, what would make something good horror, I think, is definitely atmosphere, scares. What makes a good horror game for me, anyways, would be, in addition to atmosphere and scares, it actually being fun, like just kind of, and by fun, I mean like the good balance between something being at stake. So that could be, like inventory, but not so it's like difficult and frustrating. I think the pepper metaphor is great. Like, just enough pepper, but if there's too much pepper, then you're just frustrated and sneezing all the time. But yeah, like, as I always say, like, for difficulty, like, I want to be scared. I don't want to be stressed. I want to kind of be taken into the world, and there be something at stake, but not be banging my head against the wall.
I've got to be honest, it doesn't take me that much pepper to get me sneezing in that metaphor. Much like Sabrina, I'm not a horror person at all. And it could just be my personal interest in the world and games and film and pretty much everything else. But for me, audio is one of those really key factors, both in terms of making a good horror game, but also just making good horror in general. If you mute a horror movie, the random person jumping out from behind something, it might startle you, but it's not going to scare you nearly as much as the violins and the cello rising and the heartbeat in the background kind of enticing you forward. Those moments in horror games where the audio is pulsing, it really gets your heart racing, and then all of a sudden it's a quiet moment and you need to throw a book to distract somebody. Those very key audio signatures are a really immersive factor in horror. And to me, that's one of the things that I both love to think about and hate to interact with.
I also think that there should be like a degree of difference between like something that's scary and something that kind of instills horror in you, because things that instill horror kind of leave you with this feeling of helplessness. When we think of stuff like cosmic horrors, there are these beings that are beyond our comprehension and make us feel like ants in terms of like how we can actually feel. And it's like taking away of our autonomy and making us feel helpless and putting us in a state in which we're just at the mercy of whatever horror we're experiencing, which is something that the atmosphere definitely helps with.
Yeah, I guess playing an I feel like I really like what Leah said about audio, because it's so true. I mean, you hear people that say, like, if you're scared by a horror movie, just turn off the volume or turn off the sound. And it's really true. I was thinking about playing playing through some of the games we played through here, but like Silent Hill 2, like a normal hallway, and there's no normal hallways in Silent Hill 2, can be kind of boring, but like, I don't know, there's a couple you walk through where there's just weird noises or like thumps happening, and like that makes just like a weird hallway super scary.
I'm mostly going to be looking at Visage a little bit here, but because Visage was really good about that whole, because it incorporates a similar sanity mechanic that Amnesia has, but it really relied on the sound as well as obviously the darkness to sort of throw you off. And oh my gosh, like I was still, the other night I still had a nightmare about that game. But even The Forest, which is another game, and it's probably the only quote unquote horror game that I can actually handle. It whenever you hear the cannibals, you'll hear a scream in the distance, and you won't necessarily see them right away, and then suddenly you hear very quick footprints, and then they're like basically right there attacking you. So I feel like that audio sort of like what it does is it ends up taking power or advantage away from the player a lot of the time. Like you hear something, so you have the knowledge that something's there, but you half the time can't see where it's coming from and you don't know what it is, so it's completely taken all power and control away from you in that moment.
It's also like suspense too. Like for The Forest, you hear the kind of like cannibal people coming up. In Silent Hill 2, you have the radio mechanic that starts going scratchy when like something's near, and it's almost like it's like something bad's gonna happen soon. And you're like, what? What is it? Oh my god!
And it's kind of weird that like with video games having their like main defining feature as some sort of agency, that we find our agency kind of reduced to like our immediate surroundings in terms of horror.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that agency and especially the limited surroundings, kind of calling back to it, Sabrina somehow didn't dig into. It shocked me, the association of audio and light and like walking through the darkness in games like Visage and Amnesia. And an interesting example, which isn't horror, but it was like psychologically horror enough for me to have to put it down, which is Gone Home. Nothing bad happens to you in that game as far as my memory stands. But every time you walk into a room and the lights are off, that like frantic search to try to reach the light switch in time is so deeply rooted, at least in me, probably in more people than just me. At least I hope. But the way that that agency is taken away from you, where you are forced to do a particular task, meaning turn the lights on, before anything else can be done without sort of driving yourself to that point of, why did I make this decision? That I think horror games try to simulate in that sanity mechanic, as problematic or acceptable as you may want to think it could be.
I think I didn't touch on that because I was too busy being afraid of the game to think about it too much.
I mean, Visage and Amnesia have the like kind of the darkness and lightness like affect kind of your almost your health, your like sanity meter, which is an issue we'll probably get into later. But you know, like not only does making it dark make it scary, but it makes it more scary because you're like, you know, losing health or you know, some kind of thing like that.
Yeah, I guess that's back to that like resource or asset or inventory management too, because the whole thing with, well, at least with Visage, is that you have to like make sure that you turn on the lights, but then half the time like the paranormal things in the house will then turn them off. So but if you stay in the dark for too long, then you have to either find a new light source, or you've got to like take your anti-insanity pills, which again, we'll probably talk about the problematicness of that, for lack of a better term. But so you end up having to manage these resources, but also the environment around you in a way so that it's a little bit less horrifying, but then half the time you can't do that. And if you let your sanity drop too much, then something really scary happens. And, well, okay. I thought it was really scary. My partner completely disagreed with me and thought it was ridiculous. But basically, the ghost will come after you or whatever, and you die. So it's this really weird, like, balance between the environment and also your inventory and also the light and also the sounds, and it's just a lot happening, but at the same time not a lot happening. I'm not sure if that makes any sense.
No, definitely. Like I played like a run through of Visage, and like I found like I would be flicking on lights as much as I could and like going to check something out, and then like a light behind me would turn off, so I'd have to run back and like flick that light on again, and then it would like flicker, or like I think this one room is safe, and it turns out the ghosts have like been in there when I was gone and turned off all the lights again. Like it's yeah, it's kind of hectic, but all you're doing is walking through a house turning on lights.
Could one of you give us a bit of a synopsis for what exactly these games are?
So it opens with a scene where this family is murdered, and it is in the first person point of view, and it looks like you're in the perspective of the murderer. That being said, when you actually start playing the game, it's not fully clear that you are, in fact, that same person. But what you do get is when you finally have control over the character, it's again first person point of view. You know your name is, I want to say it's Dave or something generic like that. And you haven't left the house in several weeks. And basically you walk through it and you have to try to figure out what happened. Presumably what happened to the family that you see murdered in the very first scene. But at the same time, you have to try to manage the paranormal activity that's going on, or if it's even happening. Like it's all dependent on how you interpret the entire sanity mechanic. Like is it actually paranormal stuff happening, or is it just your character going a little bit insane? But then as you sort of move through, you discover the horrors of what actually has occurred in that house. We didn't end up getting to complete the game because the game does not make it very easy to complete, and we sort of gave up halfway through, which makes me a little bit sad. But presumably you do find out in the end who you are in relation to the killer and all of that stuff. So yeah, I think that's pretty much a half decent synopsis, I hope.
It's also in early access too, so I didn't even know that you could get to the end. But I also noticed there's some doors that kind of really break your immersion that you click on and they're like, that's not available in this version. And you're like, what? Like it's going to be added.
Yeah, you're right, because it is early access. I think they haven't released the final chapter, so I don't know if you actually ever end up finding out.
So would we say then that Visage is good horror?
So in my opinion, it did what a horror is supposed to do, and it scared me. So I give it a thumbs up. But when I was talking with my partner, who is a horror aficionado, because I had to do this with him because I can't handle horror. So it was basically like we were playing it together because that was the only way I was going to be able to get through it. And he was saying that it didn't hit all the notes of a good horror for him because too many things ended up breaking that sense of immersion, mainly that it sort of restricted you so much in what you were able to do. So that whole access to the environment and things like that it didn't actually end up doing it well, and all it did was pull you out of the game. Like, it's one thing to have it where it's difficult to figure out what's going on and you don't fully know what's happening, but you need to leave enough clues and things like that so that the player gets a sense of what's going on as they move through. Like, he was using, I think, Resident Evil 2 as his comparison, which I've never been able to handle any of the Resident Evil games, but for me, a good horror is one that can scare the crap out of me, which is not very hard. So for me, it was good enough. It wasn't necessarily a good game, but it was good enough at being a horror game because of the fact that it completed the task of scaring the crap out of me.
Yeah, when I played it, I feel like I'm in the same boat as Colin. I found it more frustrating than scary. Like, I feel like my frustration with it kind of overshadowed the horror of it. But it was scary, but I don't know. I was also turned off just because, like, there's titles at the beginning that really are just kind of like, this is not for the faint of heart. This is going to kind of blow your face off. And, like, It's just like, you guys are you're going too hard right now. So I was kind of prepped for something that was going to be edgy. So I think that kind of poisoned the well for me. What I think is a really good horror, though, would be Resident Evil 7.
Oh, yeah.
And I know that you played that, Joey, right? So did you want to talk about Resident Evil 7?
Oh, I would love to recount of the couple evenings that me and my friend spent in each other's warm and chilled embrace playing Resident Evil 7. So I wanna preface my review of Resident Evil 7 is that the the Resident Evil games after Resident Evil 4 focused a bit too much on action in terms of like what they had to offer as a horror game, and it was just giving the player a bit too much autonomy. Andrew Bailey has an article on First Person Scholar regarding the Resident Evil, but I think that with Resident Evil 7 they kind of got back on board because there is a good degree of action. You do have autonomy to a better degree than would most horror games, where you can actually shoot guns and kill the things that are like chasing you, which sounds like a zombie game. But essentially the premise is you're looking for your girlfriend who went missing about 2 years ago or so. You go to this house and then you end up being a prisoner in this house where this the most dysfunctional family kind of lives, and you are introduced to them at this dinner where they're eating kind of like rotten flesh, and they all go off into their separate sections of the premises, and you're kind of left there at the beginning to fight the dad. And the thing about the dad is he doesn't die. Like, you have this autonomy where you can like shoot him in the face with a shotgun and pump him full of lead, but like you can hit him with a car, you can set him on fire, you can hit him with an axe. Nothing brings him down, and then at one point it does, but he's back up on his feet the moment like you turn around, and that is scary as shit. Now that happens a couple of times to the points where I think you blow part of his head off and he comes back, and then you like blow his entire you take off the entire like upper part of his body above the waist, and then he comes back after that as well. So just in terms of like what Resident Evil 7 has to offer in terms of autonomy, it makes you feel like you have that agency that typical video games do, but it also makes you kind of feel hopeless in confronting this evil entity that is beyond, that seems to be beyond any conventional ways of killing it.
I really liked how Resident Evil 7, like with just that Jack character, like that first chapter where you're against Jack, it has, so like Outlast is one of those games that is very, very scary, but like too much, and all you kind of do is run away and hide. Whereas Resident Evil 7, I felt, had that, like there were parts where you just have to run away from Jack, but then there are parts where you can actually like give it to him and like, you know, run your car into him over and over again. So it's kind of like that play of giving you some power against him to kind of like get your yayas out or whatever, but then it, you know, comes back in your face when you think you killed him and he's back again, and you're just, you don't know what to do. You're like, your character's missing their hand, they don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going on. It's really horrifying, but it still skirts the line of being too, like, it doesn't get to the point where it's too frustrating.
And the thing that like keeps you constantly on edge is the lack of resources in the game. Like every single time me and my friend entered a room, we were just like checking the inventory. All right, I have 5 bullets with like the handgun. I have 2 bullets with the shotgun. I have 3 healing potions. Let's do this. We're good. And then we die, come back, and then we start it all again. But like we can like do multiple tries at it. But it's like it's for that moment in which you actually have to take inventory into account, which is my least favorite part of the game. You are kind of at the mercy of whatever you can scrounge.
Yeah, Resident Evil is good with the like inventory and the inventory management, and the being like, you can only hold so much. Like when I was playing through Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, like you have to balance and be like, okay, do I have enough bullets to get through this one part? Or like, do I sacrifice having space in my inventory so that I can bring this bigger weapon?
Yeah, the inventory management kind of really connects to Amnesia, The Dark Descent, which is potentially the most well-known horror game on the internet, and I tried to play it. And I'm not going to say I finished it because I did not, and I'm not going to say the game kept me from finishing it because the only thing that kept me from finishing it is that I am a chicken. But to give a brief narrative summary, you are, as expected from the title, an amnesiac. You wake up with essentially no idea what's going on aside from follow the dripping water and potentially try to escape the castle. And you come across various puzzles that you need to solve. You come across various unstoppable enemies that you need to hide and run from. And that's about the extent of where I got to, as my partner was sitting beside me, laughing at me constantly as I buried boxes in front of myself and had more fun throwing things around rather than I did actually doing anything I was supposed to. But I think in a way that's actually what makes a good horror game, is that there are those reprieves that you really can take a minute and see if you can set the broom that you found in the closet on fire in one of the fireplaces. And that's one of the sort of architectural design pieces of a horror game, where if it's light, if it's a big open room funneling down into a bunch of closed, tight hallways, which Amnesia does fairly well and curse the game, but it really does provide the opportunity to startle yourself, scare yourself, have something scare you, and kind of build the anticipation for it. And I think that anticipation, that suspense, as Patrick was saying earlier, kind of fundamentally gets at the core of those things. I know Hellblade isn't necessarily a horror game, but it definitely has horror moments and places where the same sort of light and big open rooms, small closed hallways. I know there's one section midway near the end where there is like literally a hell beast coming after you, and if you're not standing in a torch zone, you are not going to be alive for very long. And it really forces you to interact with the world in a way that some horror games might not, that sort of interactability of things. I don't know if that's quite the same as the inventory management of Resident Evil. The two of you were I am thankful enough to say, talked me out of doing that because I can absolutely not handle gore.
Yeah, I feel so bad because I talked you out of Resident Evil 7, and then I'm like, try Amnesia. I hadn't played Amnesia in like a decade, and I'm like, it's fine. It's like just ghosts or whatever, and it's Victorian. You'll be fine. I didn't remember how freaky that game is.
I mean, it's not even that freaky. Like, it's just a matter of there's some sort of gut reaction I get from that suspense that my body's just like, I would literally rather be doing anything other than this right now. Like, I'll go stand outside in the rain. Just don't make it where there might be a monster around this corner, or I will sit here and throw books around in this room until my laptop runs out of battery.
Any glass I can chew, because I'm not going into that room.
That's actually a good point to head on over to our next question regarding the monster. So why is using the monster in the horror game an effective use of exploring the themes that the horror game kind of like puts out there?
I feel like monsters sort of give physical representations to non-physical or like metaphysical concepts or like things that can't be explained. And it's sort of, as problematic as this rabbit hole is about to get, it sort of ties into some of our deeper rooted like cultural, I guess, memories, for lack of a better term, or innate whatever, of fearing the other. And of course, that is problematic in and of itself, but I don't necessarily mean the other in the colonial context. I mean also like the other as in wild animals, like if we want to go super primal, or the other as in the environment, or the other as simply like somebody that, you know, you would have been at war with way back in the day. So creating the monster, again, as problematic as it is due to the colonial ties to that, like I think it's still so pervasive because it's such an easy, for lack of a better term, it's just an easy way to represent like things that we can't fully comprehend or explain, especially when it's something that we can't explain why we're afraid of it. So, for instance, if it's like the unknown, like I don't know what's going to happen to me if I go into that dark room, having the monster there as representative of everything bad that could possibly happen, but I don't know which of those bad things could happen is a good example. Or like using a monster to represent, say, somebody that you're at war with because you don't know that, like, you know, if you're a government in control, you don't want them to be humanized or whatever. So again, problematic, but like it's such a standard thing that's existed in our literature and in our media for forever, and I don't foresee it going away anytime soon. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that's probably not the best, but it's not always bad. Like, it can represent other fears that are legitimate and not necessarily of the other in that context. But I think it just ends up making it easy to represent things that either exist or could exist that we just don't know about.
Yeah, I think you really hit it in the kind of like an intangible force or something like that. But I think it's also important to mention that it also kind of mounts the argument that this force, this thing that it's being represented, is bad and is to be feared and is other, which you did talk about, but I kind of feel like it bears repeating that I kind of feel like it's saying this is ugly and frightening kind of thing.
I have a bit of an off-topic thing, but just because I really think it's cool. One of the predominant theories about why so many cultures have like this draconic figure or dragon figure in their mythos is because of like this evolved fear that humankind has collectively over predatory birds, predatory cats, and snakes, which is kind of like the dragon is kind of like a combination of all three of those things, which I think is pretty cool. But like it kind of ties into Sabrina's point.
I didn't even know that. That's actually really cool.
Yeah. Did anyone else have something to add about monster use?
This is going to tie into like a question that we have later on, but like the way that the monster is utilized, as Sabrina was saying, the fear of the other can be problematic, even in video games, where you have like or one of the better examples would be in film, where the film Psycho, the person has a dissociative identity disorder, which is called multiple personality disorder, and they blame that alternate personality as like the reason that he was going around murdering people, which is problematic. And I think there are a couple other examples in video games, but I can't quite pull them out of my head because the one in Resident Evil 7 that I played and the ones that I've been exposed to more or less haven't been too bad.
Resident Evil 5 is a fantastic example of bad monster use. If you read it's the article Andre Brock's When Keeping It Real Goes Wrong, it's called, but he talks about how Resident Evil 5 you have Chris Redfield and he comes in to Africa, and Africa the people are have become zombies, but they are speaking a different language to him. There's something about the zombie virus that makes them more tribal. Like, it's a very disgusting kind of like racial othering through making them like savage monsters. And then this white guy, famous meathead Chris Redfield, comes in to save the day, and his like companion can speak is like half like a native of Africa, wherever they're. It's a made up place, but it's standing in for Africa. I think so. I might be wrong. But she's like very British. But yeah. Anyways, I'm tumbling over my own words. But check out Andre Brock's When Keeping It Real Goes Bad, or just look at Resident Evil 5. You'll see it. It's pretty gross.
Something that always gets me, and this is actually the main reason why I can't handle horror, is that whole, so when the monster gets used to represent things that can't fully be explained, there's sort of like a double layer of fear that happens, particularly when they use the paranormal, because for those of us who grew up in religious households, such as myself, the paranormal takes on a full different sort of like, it's not just something that's potentially fake to represent something that's potentially real, like a very real fear, it becomes like a double layer of actually this could potentially be real, just maybe not in the same way. So then it's like 2 layers of fear, which sucks for me because it plays on something that's like so deeply ingrained within, my childhood and growing up, that then like I become the kid again when I'm faced with the paranormal monster in the horror film or the horror game or whatever, specifically when I'm playing the game. So like when I was playing Visage, the fact that there was a ghost and there was all this stuff happening, it felt a little too a little too real. Whereas when I play The Forest, there's like a lot more scientific explanations that help you figure out the other monsters on the island besides the cannibals. And also I've never had experience with cannibals, so it's still more representative than it is real. Whereas when you have the paranormal, for some people it's 2 layers of reality, which I always found interesting, but also obviously terrifying.
Mm-hmm. That's something I haven't thought about. That's creepy.
I think that representation, especially of like a societally understood norm, and especially in terms of the cannibal, makes a lot of sense in terms of horror and scary stories, ghost stories, as far back as like oral tradition, things like the Wendigo from indigenous culture, where it's essentially just a tale of, even if you're starving, don't eat people. Like ultimately they kind of boil down to a sort of fable in a way. Horror is designed to encourage you to behave in a societally appropriate way and not deviate from that. And then we've kind of turned it into this thing where it's no, we just like to feel scared for some reason that I really don't understand. Somebody at me on Twitter, help me understand.
I think that's where like Resident Evil 7 kind of like pulls everything back into perspective, and it kind of like shows this messed up dysfunctional family where you have a very like, they're all monsters, but like you have this physically abusive father, this controlling mother, this psychopathic brother, and a very what's it called, estranged daughter, kind of in their nuclear family, where it kind of shows like a terrifying representation of all these like tropes that we see a lot in modern culture and probably have had more than enough experience with, but it like puts it in, it sets it in the light of a horror game where these are now the people that imprison you. And for people who've never been in that scenario, this is not an okay thing. This is something that is very fresh in terms of media, because you don't often get an abusive family as like the setting of a horror game, which I find phenomenal.
One of my favorite horror movies is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Resident Evil 7, the beginning at least really reminds me of that. You like having this grotesque version of the nuclear family, I think, is kind of the monster of the game, which I think is really interesting. And I think what Resident Evil like the tagline to Resident Evil 7 was "Horror Comes Home," and I think it's really that game, I would argue, is like really saying like, it's showing you how perverted the idea of like, I mean, I think it's criticizing America. It takes place in America, but the American ideal of this nuclear family, or of these family values that kind of leave out all these other ideas of what a family is or how people should act, and it really kind of like steamrolls, like the characters literally like kill this guy who's trying to come and like separate their nuclear family, trying to change their values. He kind of represents like an outside force coming in. But do you think it's okay to give spoilers?
It's a 2-year limit for spoilers. If something's been out there for more than 2 years, it's all free unless you like know the person's going to be playing it soon.
Okay. Well, I want to say this spoiler, because part of my argument is that, so Resident Evil 7 is saying, like traditional American family values are poisonous. And like not only poisonous, like there are creatures that are made from this poison, but also like your character is coming to rescue the girlfriend who has been like taken in by this family, and she is this like she has become this kind of like subservient daughter imprisoned figure, and you find out later in the game that she was actually kind of like this badass like special forces person coming into sort of stop this ghost character that's actually controlling the whole family. But she was this badass who is then, after being poisoned by this force that is creating the family, now this like imprisoned subservient daughter character. So so I kind of feel like the monster in this case really works to kind of show what good family values is actually just toxic.
Monsters generally just kind of are that unstoppable force that you were talking about earlier in terms of Resident Evil 7, and is very, very clear in Amnesia that there is ultimately nothing you can do to stop them until you essentially get to the end of the game, and there is some narrative a MacGuffin to solve the problem effectively. The monsters are sort of that embodiment of everything, like Sabrina was saying. I don't have a whole lot of unique thoughts other than to kind of summarize what people have said. It's interesting when we start moving towards the mental health side of things with sanity, with kind of alternate health pools and kind of mental illness as a way of describing why something is monstrous.
Continuing on Amnesia, since you just played it, Leah, how does the like mental health work?
The mental is described as sanity. I very vividly remember like the "you are doing well" is essentially you have a slight headache. So immediately in the game, you are never perfectly fine. You start off with a headache, and that's as much as you were ever going to feel good about yourself. And then it progressively gets into a pulsing and pressure, and eventually if you stand in the dark for too long, if too many weird things happen, you'll lose, effectively. You pass out, you wake up. Nothing good happens from standing in the dark. That's what I've learned. I'm like devolving back to my childhood fears of I can't go downstairs without turning on the lights. This is what happens in October. People make me play horror games. They make me watch horror movies. And all of a sudden, like, your inner child comes out.
Maybe next year we should do Nice-tober and, like, play puppy games or Nintendogs.
Would be so happy about that because literally for like 2 weeks straight, I have had to sleep with like not a nightlight, but like I have these little string lights in the bedroom that I have had to turn on. And then when my partner comes to bed, then he turns them off because I can't fall asleep in the dark anymore.
So that's where I think is a good segue for our last one. Last question. How can game developers get a sense of the line between exploring mental health and problematically portraying it?
Right. So, I mean, that kind of talked about in Amnesia. I think one way you can not do it is have your insanity go up, and how you make your insanity go down is to chug pills like in Visage.
Oh, don't even get me started with that. No, we are going to go there.
Like, go.
Oh, okay, so that bothered me because it was kind of ridiculous, because in the very first, like, one of the first few rooms, you just find, like, a stupid amount of pills, and then later you can't find any, so I guess that's fair for the resource management, but it just seemed poorly placed. But also, like, what even... Who even thought of that as being okay? Because that really bothered me because, like, even if somebody is... Let's take depression or something, and this is only because I have a friend who has depression, so I know a little bit about how that works. Like, the antidepressants don't just magically make everything better. So that's just, like, a logically dumb mechanic, if you ask me. And it just made me angry. And I'm sorry for getting so angry and heated, but yeah.
What would be better is, like, like I have, like, anxiety, and what I do is I, do meditations or like say things in my mind, like, you know, thoughts are just thoughts, they're not real. Like, if you could press a button where he says, like, you know, he takes 5 minutes to just kind of like decompress and like, you know, but not chug pills.
Well, and that's kind of interesting. Like I was talking architecturally, the way games are, they give the player that opportunity where there are those big open areas that you have a chance to breathe. But they don't ever give that to the player, or to the character so much. Because usually you start getting your sanity back and amnesia in the light. But it only progresses so far. I don't know how Visage works quite so much. But that idea of having any consumable that like heals psychological well-being rather than like adrenaline to kind of physically force you to keep going, which even the way adrenaline is used in games is like not accurate, but we're not going to go there. So it's interesting, the distinction between player and character, I think.
I think that one of the main issues is that people who aren't familiar enough with mental health issues try and write in-game mechanics that kind of work, and the most that they have to base in-game mechanics on are physical things. So if you want to heal up a scratch that you have a health potion. So how do you heal something that is impacting your character in a mental way? Well, there has to be a physical thing in a game. MacGuffin strikes again, as Lia put it, where it's just this sort of like easily fixed thing, as opposed to the developers taking the time to kind of learn how it works and figuring out an in-game mechanic that could kind of like help the character kind of like come down from that anxiety attack that they might be having. So if they could actually like implement like safe spaces where they could like calm down for a second, that might be a bit better than having to chug a handful of pills, because even best case scenario, that's just taken way out of context.
Take horror, you know, remove insanity meters, take horror out of the asylum. Like, there's so many, and I use asylum purposely. Like, there's so many horror games that take place in a psychiatric hospital. I like made a list just off the top of my head. I was thinking like Outlast 1 and 2, Darkness 2, Manhunt 2, the Call of Cthulhu games, Sanitarium. Actually, I think just the Xbox Call of Cthulhu game. Anyways, Inpatient, Black Bay Asylum. There's a game even coming out in 2020 or 2021 called Asylum. You know, it's by Senscape. Senscape, you should be ashamed of yourselves.
I actually have a colleague of mine. She's in disability, MAD in disability studies, or also known as like health humanities. Sorry, not that it's also known as, rather it falls under that umbrella. But she's also a massive horror fan. So I kind of looked to her when I was thinking about this question, because obviously she has a lot more expertise on the detrimental problematic side of things. And so I'm actually going to just like quote this conversation that I had with her, because I think it's really, really important. Her name is Sarah Curry. You should go check her research out. So she said, making the decision to exploit neurosis or psychosis for entertainment value is a choice that's been deployed in a ton of horror games, but it seems to be an increasingly regressive choice in light of the last few years of research. There are obviously less offensive ways to stereotype mental disorder, but using mental disorder to produce horror is a little ethically devoid. Showrunners should seek other avenues for creating reality breaks that don't imply disorder or pathologize certain people who live with very real day-to-day horrors, which is basically a much better way of saying everything that I've sort of thought and been unable to articulate. I think to boil it down and oversimplify it from like a game or a player perspective, I'm just getting sort of bored of it. And I think that we can do more. And I think that constantly going back to this is not only harmful and negatively impactful to vulnerable populations, specifically those who, have to actually deal with these real life situations, But it's also just like it's getting way too repetitive from a gameplay standpoint. Like I kind of just, not that I do horror, but when I was talking to my partner about this, he said the same thing. Like he kind of just wants to see something new because he's kind of tired of seeing Amnesia over and over and over again with games like Visage or whatever else has come out, because since Amnesia, like a lot of them, that's surged in popularity. And even he said, like, I'm starting to get tired of it, and there's a million other ways you could scare people and still achieve what you want without having to rely on these tired and played out mechanics.
Today that we're recording this October 20th. The newest Amnesia game has released, Amnesia Rebirth. So it's still going on.
Yeah, one of the things about horror is that tropes shouldn't last long in terms of like what horror genre has to offer, because when you expect something to happen as you understand tropes to do, and you can see it play out in movies and games and things, and it's very simple things usually. It gives you this sense of familiarity with it, which is good for other genres of games, but it's not good for the horror genre, because once you feel familiar with the horror genre, it stops doing its job. It stops giving you that sense of unpredictability, and when it becomes predictable, it's just another game.
Yeah, I don't know. I would argue that sometimes predictability in horror is nice. Like that's why people watch slasher movies all the time, because they know what's going to happen. But yeah, I mean, I also have agree with you too. I think also tropes, when they're damaging, should just cut it out, guys.
Yeah, that predictability on one hand is really viable in terms of the sanity mechanic as a sense of alternate health, as much as it is incredibly problematic, as Sabrina was quoting Sarah of saying. But it's something that is more persistent because it's not something that's meant to scare you. It's meant to kind of reinforce why you should be scared. So that persistence is sort of validated in that sense that it is a common and persistent trope. But that sort of the way you work through these tropes that are meant to scare you, you take them up and you can act with them and then purposefully divert from a little bit. So you are expecting there to be somebody around the corner, but there's not. There's a wall, and you turn around and there's somebody there. Like those sort of slight diversions or those slight differences from a trope kind of reinforce the trope in itself, but in a way that is still startling or frightening to a viewer or a player.
Now, I feel like we're wrapping up, but I was just wondering, can anyone think of good examples of mental health in video games that are horror?
I know that Silent Hill 2 did a good portrayal of like of the main character coming to term with the tragedy of his wife's death. But I don't know. I'm uncertain whether or not it actually had depression related vibes. I know it was like the trauma that he experienced, which has to do with mental health as well. But to actually like diagnose it as depression would be something entirely different. I knew that was like something that was praised for doing a good job and like sticking to a theme in a productive manner.
Yeah. Having just played Silent Hill 2, it doesn't. I mean, he is having visions and stuff, but it doesn't overly lean on that kind of like he's going crazy thing. It's kind of just the horror story. So yeah, I think that's definitely something to it. I think like giving agency is really important, to giving agency beyond making it like a superpower or like something that hurts you, like an insanity meter. Um, my example was there's this game, I think it's free on Steam, called Tastes Like Cardboard, which is a horror game about mental health, but it's made by someone who suffers depression, about their like the very kind of scary experience, lonely, isolating experience of their depression. So I think that's something that's really built around mental health, but is a lot more of an ethical depiction of it. So there's hope.
Yeah, I think, again, not really a horror game per se, but Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, kind of is a good example of that, where from the very beginning of the game, it says this is a game sort of based around psychosis and the experience of psychosis. We've consulted like professionals, neuropsychologists, people who experience this sort of thing, and really attempt to do it justice as somebody who does not experience psychosis and nor have a good understanding of it. I can't say whether they did it ethical justice, but it at least shows to me that they were trying to do it. And I think it is kind of that step. And I know there's a sequel coming out, so I'm excited to see if they continue to try to do their best on it.
I think the ultimate message of our Halloween podcast should be take care of yourself.
Yes, and also don't let people convince you to not only play scary games that you know you can't handle, but to play them in the dark. Because that's what happened to me, and it was awful. Just to end on a lighter note.
All right, then why don't we all introduce each other, ourselves one last time, as well as social media stuff, just so people can find us.
Yeah, so again, I am Sabrina. I'm the editor-in-chief / book reviews and interviews section head. You can @ me on Twitter @ Sabrina Alicia SG, or you can find me on Twitch, twitch.tv/BrainiacBree.
And I'm Patrick. I'm not much on social media, but please come find me on twitch.tv/Dr. Sandmonster. That's DR. Yeah, I stream every week for FPS. It's a lot of fun. So I hope to see you there.
I'm Lia, or Lillian. You'll find me occasionally on Twitter @ Lillian_A_Black. And as always, you can send me commentaries at firstpersonscholar.com. You might want to go to the FPS website just to make sure I didn't get that wrong.
And I'm Giuseppe Femia. I'm the podcast producer for First Person Podcast. I'm on Twitter now. You can find me @ _foolsbait. So thanks for listening to us talk about our gaming experience and what these experiences mean on a broader scale. Let us know if you think Bloodborne is a horror game. You can find us @ FPS Weekly or start a conversation using the hashtag First Person Podcast on Twitter. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femia with the support from Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.